everyone seems so worried about failing, worried about public embarrassment or humiliation, worried about being canceled. But what if I told you that unarguably the most important man in the history of the United States of America, an icon of American culture, the main founding father, and the first president of the United States of America was all three? He was a colossal failure. In fact, his failure started the first global war, one that killed more than 1 million people. And if that's not enough, afterwards, number two, he was humiliated. He made another terrible decision and faced public disgrace for it. And then number three, he got canceled, or let's just say relieved of duties, for almost 2 decades as a result. Here's the story of the OG George W. that most people don't know, or quite frankly, ends up getting lost and overwhelmed by the glory of what becomes his future Wikipedia entries. George W., as in George Washington, wasn't formally educated. At the tender age of 17, George became a surveyor in Virginia. At this point, the United States, only the coastal areas of the East were settled. So you have the coastal area, then some civilization, then these hills and mountains, and then beyond that is the Ohio River Valley. The Ohio Valley is at this point only sparsely settled. There's almost nobody there. It's mostly wilderness. People are just starting to go over the hills and set up farms and settlements. But there's a problem there. The French, who are settled in Canada, they keep coming down saying that they have claim to this Ohio area. So there becomes a conflict between the British colonists and these French folks. And the French also have allied with the Indians, causing further problems. So the Brits decide someone from the British colony needs to go and tell the French to buzz off. George, now 21, has been out on the frontier as a surveyor and has proven to be a good woodsman. So he gets appointed second in command, with a general over him for this mission. However, the guy who they appoint as general of this little army is old and fat and slow. And as fate would have it, on the trek out, the general catches a disease and dies only weeks into the trip. Suddenly, George is the head honcho of the Virginia troops. And before they were expecting it, they run into those dastardly French troops. The French fire on George and his little army. Washington regroups his troops and then they fire back. Washington actually gets the better of the French. While they are winning, they hear the French screaming and throwing up their hands. They want to surrender. So when George goes to talk to them, the French say, "Hey, we're a diplomatic detachment. We were coming just to talk to you guys. We weren't here to fight at all." Washington says, "You're full of shiitake, pardon my French," or something like that. He says, "Well, then why did you fire on us first?" They say, No, this is a big misunderstanding. We have diplomatic papers. So you guys actually have been shooting and killing diplomats, which is a big international no, by the way. Washington says, "Yeah, I don't believe you, Frenchie." So Big George takes the survivors prisoner. He takes them back to the little fort that he's constructed in the forest. The reality is, we don't really know if the French were being deceptive or whether they were really diplomats. They could have had diplomatic papers in case they got caught in a bad situation, and that is what Washington believed. Or it may have been as they said. We don't know. The exact circumstances are still debated. But what happens next is definitely not an accident. Additional French forces show up and attack Washington's little fort, and Big George does a terrible job defending it. The fort is poorly positioned and not nearly strong enough to be defensible. After a few hours, a third of his men, more than 100 men, are dead, and many others are left with various life-threatening wounds. Eventually, a French commander named De Vere pulls up a flag of ceasefire and asks to come talk. He offers Washington papers of surrender on very lenient terms. He'll give George a total ceasefire and allow the Virginians to retreat with military honors with no other conditions on them, other than a simple apology from Washington. And George was too young and inexperienced to realize the trap that was being laid for him. That simple apology was a huge mistake. It was essentially an admission that the British, remember we were still British subjects back then, had known that the French force that they had initially encountered and beaten were a diplomatic mission, which means George and company had assassinated them. Now, that was not true, but that was what Washington was admitting to in the cleverly disguised language of this treaty. And this is what set off a diplomatic crisis that resulted in what became known as the 7 Years' War, which essentially is the first truly global war that involved most of the great powers of the time, including Britain, France, Spain, Austria, and Prussia, with major fighting on 5 continents where more than 1 million people died, both soldiers and civilian casualties. And it was George Washington who had set it all off by signing this poison pill contract. Essentially, George Washington shed the first blood. That started a world war where 1 million people died. Later, Washington would make another colossal strategic error that left him embarrassed and humiliated. That got good old George canceled, aka relieved from duty from the military. George retreated to civilian life as a farmer and would not serve in the military for 17 years thereafter. So, I share this story because if you think that you have failed, that you have done something so stupid, made a mistake so egregious that you don't feel like you can come back from it, just remember that George Washington, the big kahuna, founding father, the man whose face dons the peak of Mount Rushmore, the United States dollar bill, and every freaking quarter, that guy, he screwed up so badly that he started a world war and got 1 million people killed. He also put his nation in a compromised position at the start of it and made a few other really bad calls. That guy still rose to greatness. In fact, if you go to the capital of the United States, which is called Washington, by the way, and you go into the Capitol building and you look up at the 4,664-foot fresco painted on the canopy of the dome above the rotunda floor, you will see the Apotheosis of Washington. It depicts George Washington sitting as a god, rising to the heavens in glory, flanked by female figures representing liberty and victory. The term apotheosis is the title referring to the transformation of a person into a god, serving as a metaphor for Washington's elevation to a national icon. So, if he can go from colossal failure, public embarrassment and humiliation, and being canceled professionally, to a god and national icon, I think whatever failure or embarrassment you or I have suffered, I think we can recover. Fascinating stuff, right? Hey, how about you helping some others out there? What was, or what you thought was, a life or career-ending failure, embarrassment, or humiliation that you suffered that ended up not being so bad based on your success of today? Make some notes in your Darren Daily Journal, and then share that quick story with us in the comments below.